I understand that it's easy to stay in certain ecosystems when speaking to media figures. So I do appreciate you venturing out and kind of being willing to speak to me here.
I appreciate you having me on, Brian. I want to speak to everybody, including people who don't agree with me on issues. I want to say this: my vaccination policy will not take away vaccines from anybody who wants access to them. My only issue is they should not be mandated. I don't think any medical intervention should be mandated. And let me just say this: that right now, the CDC is recommending the 9th COVID booster. Oh, that's their recommendation. 90% of Americans have made a decision not to take it. Do you think that the federal government should do what they did with the first booster, which is to tell people, okay, you can't work, you can't travel, you can't get on an airplane, you can't go to your job unless you do what CDC says? So I don't think that most Americans want that. What I want is good testing, good safety testing for vaccines, good efficacy testing, so that everybody can make informed consent about whether they want this product or not, whether it's good for their age group, whether it's good for their cohort, whether it's good for them. And let's do the same kind of safety testing that we require for other drugs. And we don't do that for vaccines. Vaccines are exempt. The only medical product that's exempt from pre-licensing safety studies. And of the 72 vaccines now mandated for our children, not one of them has ever been tested in a pre-licensing safety study. That's just wrong. We know people get injured, and that's who I'm concerned with. If you're fine with it, if you've gotten a good result, you should be able to get it. We ought to be not telling people when they're injured that it didn't happen and gaslighting them and punishing doctors who report injuries. We should be doing good science, and we should be supporting people who actually get injured by these products.
I think I don't have the numbers right in front of me, but the numbers are pretty clear in terms of the efficacy and the safety of this COVID vaccine. And it was used on the biggest, on the largest scale of any vaccine in America, in the history of the world. And again, those numbers are pretty clear in terms of the efficacy of this vaccine, in terms of the number of hospitalizations and deaths for people who didn't get the vaccine versus those who did get the vaccine.
Okay, Brian, you know what? You're talking about data that does not exist. And I'll just tell you a couple of things. Our country had the worst body count from COVID of any country in the world and one of the most aggressive vaccination schedules. We had 60%.
I would also say that we had the Republican president who was not exactly advocating for vaccinations or even taking the virus itself seriously. I mean, Donald Trump was downplaying the severity of the virus, but it became politicized.
Now you're talking crazy talk, but let me just finish this.
It became completely politicized, and there was a clear delineation.
President Trump brags about the vaccine as the miracle of his administration, the Operation Warp Speed, the greatest accomplishment of his administration. So he wasn't hostile to the vaccine. He was doing whatever Anthony Fauci
There was a clear partisan divide in terms of people who would take the vaccine. But I'll let you go. Go ahead.
Let's just talk about data. We had 16% of the COVID deaths in our country. We only had 4.2% of the world's population. So why isn't somebody explaining to us why we had the highest death rate in the world? We were told that Haiti and Nigeria were going to get wiped out from COVID. Haiti had a 1.3% vaccination rate. It had a death rate from COVID, 1/200th of our death rate. Nigeria had a 1.4% vaccination rate. It had a death rate from COVID of 14 per million population. We had a death rate of 3,000 per million population. So there's no correlation between vaccination and death counts. In fact, the best studies, like the Cleveland Clinic study, which is 56,000 patients, one of the biggest studies, shows that people who got vaccinated were more likely to get COVID. There is no study that shows that COVID had a beneficial impact on deaths. I know that you're told that. This is orthodoxy, but the studies just simply don't exist. And the clinical trial study is never measured for that. In fact, Pfizer's clinical study, which is the one that is made public, showed that people in the placebo group were 23% less likely to die and people in the vaccine groups. The vaccine, if you got vaccinated, you're 23% more likely to die of all causes over the next 6 months, with a 500% increase in cardiac arrest. We're now seeing a whole generation of kids who are dying from cardiac arrest on the playing fields. We're seeing athletes drop dead on the playing fields at rates we've never seen in history, and nobody is explaining that. And the press, the liberal media, is not asking the questions, was that person vaccinated, and does this? We're seeing 2 of the 4 vaccines have now been pulled because of pericarditis, myocarditis, thrombocytopenia, which is blood clots. We're seeing larger excess deaths last year after vaccination with no COVID and during the height of COVID. So nobody can explain these. But what you were saying about a decline in deaths simply because of the vaccination, that data simply do not exist. But all the data,
I'll be happy to put it on the screen. I obviously can't grab it.
All the data that I am looking at, for example, take a look at the Cleveland Clinic study. Take a look at the studies that are coming out of Europe right now. One after the other, they're showing that there was no beneficial impact to the vaccines. There may have been. I mean, one of the problems during COVID is that we had information chaos. We didn't, Dr. Fauci and his cohorts were not giving us good information on basic things like infection fatality rates and the use of therapeutic drugs and comparisons between ivermectin, hydroxychloroquine, famotidine, all these other drugs that demonstrated efficacy against COVID, and comparing those against vaccines. We never saw those kind of data, and that's what we should have seen. That's what good managers would have done.
So I have something here from the CDC. Vaccinated Americans are up to 14 times less likely to die from COVID. That was from the CDC.
Yeah, and show me. 23. Right. And those studies that CDC cranks out are modeling studies. They're not data studies. They're not observational studies. They're not epidemiological studies. They're studies that show that start out with the premise, we think this is how many people are saved by the vaccine, and then they model that. But there's no actual real world data. And they use that to hoodwink you, Brian. That's how they hoodwink the American press. They use these phony studies done by biostitutes, which are these mercenary scientists who can, what they say in my.
We'll see. There is a ton of data out there that shows from people who owe their lives to the fact that they were able to get vaccines. You have people who weren't.
How can you do that study? Explain to me how you do that study. How do you do a study when somebody says, "Oh, I got the vaccine, therefore I'm alive today"? That's not science. There's plenty of people like me who didn't get it and are alive today. Should I say that I didn't get it because I'm alive today because I didn't get it?
I think you can look at the number of people who did die during COVID who weren't vaccinated, and that would tell the story pretty clearly.
Yeah, well, and guess what? The vaccinated cohorts were more likely to die than the unvaccinated cohorts. And you don't have good data because, the vaccinated cohorts were so small.
I think it's a little bit it's a little too convenient to say that any data that doesn't support your conclusion is not good data.
Oh, but I agree with that. So let's look at. I'm happy to sit down with you on another show, go study by study, and I will show you the problems with those studies, and you can show me the problems with the studies, which are overwhelming on the other side. But what I would say to you is because the public health agencies were not funding good studies during COVID, they were funding deceptive studies, that we don't have really good data where you can say definitively one way or another about each cohort. But, even CDC today is saying it's a mistake to give these vaccines to kids. The death rate to kids from COVID was zero. Why would you give them an intervention of something that does have a risk, that can kill you, if they have no risk from the disease itself? So, I think there were a lot of mistakes made.